I submitted my own VA disability claims, and I wasn't satisfied with the outcome, so I continued pursuing until I was satisfied with the outcome.
So currently you have some eligibility for benefits?
I am, yes. I'm a disabled veteran as well.
All right, well, seems like that makes a good fit for helping others do the same thing.
Agreed. I find that I can identify with a lot of the experiences with the veterans, both in the service, understanding those sort of cultural nuances, the leadership, the interplay between work tasks, work culture, and ultimately some of the disabilities that veterans have, but also as a veteran myself and working with the VA and working through the VA for my own care.
Welcome to the Victory Over VA podcast, a podcast about empowering veterans to overcome denied disability claims. Each week, we deliver critical insights to help you understand the disability process, veterans' benefits, and how to take control of your legal rights. Now here's your host, Attorney Francis Jackson.
Hey there, welcome to Victory Over VA, your guide to unlocking your VA disability benefits. If you're a veteran, this is the podcast for you. We're going to talk about how veterans' benefits work, and today we have a special guest, Chris McGhee. So, good morning, Chris.
Good morning, Jack.
How you doing?
I'm doing great.
So let's talk a little about what you're doing these days. You are currently working as an attorney, is that correct?
It is.
And what's your area of specialty?
VA disability law.
Well, that's perfect for what we do, so let's talk a little about you. You have been in the military, correct?
I have. I did 20 years in the United States Air Force.
And what kind of things did you do with the service?
Not lawyerly things. I worked on F-16 aircraft as a tactical aircraft maintenance specialist for all 20 years, coming up from junior ranks to supervisor sort of responsibilities at the end of my career.
So you ended up, would that be called a crew chief?
I was a crew chief, yeah.
All right. So tell us a little about what prompted you to go from the military onto law school.
You know, I actually wanted to be a lawyer ever since I was a teenager, but I didn't see a pathway to going to college and getting all that done, so I'd kind of say I did a 20-year detour into the military. I finished my bachelor's degree towards the end of my career and moved to Maine and went to University of Maine School of Law.
And I understand that now you're going back for a specialized degree that most lawyers don't get.
Yeah, I'm getting it's called a Master of Laws degree. I actually should be finishing here in a couple months. Essentially, it's a more robust sort of course specializing in privacy law and employment law.
And before practicing veterans law, did you have any experience with veterans benefits?
My own. When I retired in 2018, I submitted my own VA disability claims, and I wasn't satisfied with the outcome, so I continued pursuing until I was satisfied with the outcome.
So currently you have some eligibility for benefits?
I am, yes. I'm a disabled veteran as well.
All right, well, seems like that makes a good fit for helping others do the same thing.
Agreed. I find that I can identify with a lot of the experiences with the veterans, both in the service, understanding those sort of cultural nuances, the leadership, the interplay between work tasks, work culture, and ultimately some of the disabilities that veterans have, but also as a veteran myself and working with the VA and working through the VA for my own care.
So now that you are practicing law, what are some of the more interesting cases that you've seen so far?
You know, I think right off the top of my head, one of the more interesting cases is, maybe interesting isn't the right word, but part of this work is we're working with a lot of veterans that have either experiences or events in their military career that are quite impactful and oftentimes traumatic for them. But going along with recent reports from the military on sort of cultural issues centering around race and gender, I've seen a few cases where service members were impacted by hostilities or hostile work environments or things that ultimately caused them pretty strong traumatic experiences and distress.
Can you single out a particular case that you've seen that you felt the veteran had not been initially treated well by the VA and needed to appeal?
At nearly every case. While veterans law is very generous for the evidentiary burden, what I've found as both a service member and as a veteran advocate is there's a distinct culture in the military of trying to balance between reporting injuries and events in order to accurately capture your experience for a valid VA disability claim in the future. But also there is cultures of underreporting injuries due to cultural issues, underreporting things because of fear of retaliation. Certainly when we're talking about somebody that experienced a traumatic event or, a sort of harm, a psychological harm from their leadership, it's going to be very, very difficult while in the service under that amount of control, that legal and actual authority makes it very difficult to report those things. And then unfortunately, once they separate, then they have to go back and essentially recreate the evidentiary record when they're at a distinct disadvantage to collect evidence while they're in the military. And that's where it's very important to capture as much evidence as you can, even if it's contemporaneous sort of record keeping that may not be in their medical records, letters from friends that they may have disclosed to. All of those things can kind of support those things. But in my experience as someone that's in the military or had been in the military, I truly understand that it's easier to tell people to go to the doctor or seek treatment than the reality actually presents.
We've seen some cases of both women and men with military sexual trauma where that kind of issue has come up, where people have been reluctant to report. That, in your opinion, an ongoing issue in the military?
I think it is. I had a wonderful conversation with somebody that used to serve in the United States Coast Guard as a JAG attorney. This is outside the practice, but somebody I know through my network. And, when we look at what's going on at the Coast Guard Academy now, when we look at what's going on at the...
Besides the Coast Guard Academy?
Yeah, other academies, other services, there's real issues with military sexual trauma and underreporting, especially in the academies. And for me, personally, it just seems so striking that these are the sons and daughters of America, and they are competing to get into an academy. They are advocating for themselves to receive a nomination from their representative, and then to go to those academies and experience those sorts of harms, to me, is a very egregious moral wound for the country, honestly.
I can appreciate that, certainly. And you mentioned a moment ago a reference. Are you doing some podcasts of your own, separate and apart from what we're doing here?
Yeah, I've had my own podcast I started it during the pandemic, so it was a convenient way to interact when I was isolated. And eventually it turned into my own sort of platform for some work that I do.
And let's talk a little about that. You do some work trying to help veterans on an even more global scale than this.
Yeah, so, I served in aircraft maintenance for 20 years, and I had noticed that there seemed to be a lot of suicides among aircraft maintainers. And I was curious if there was information on how many, essentially, suicides by job code in the Air Force. So when I was a law student, I submitted a Freedom Information Act request to the United States Air Force asking for suicides by job code. They rejected me, and then I appealed, and my podcast had started, and I've been having conversations with people talking about their experiences, their leadership experiences, and essentially I was running a dual advocacy through seeking data to the United States Air Force to try to paint this picture of what these people were experiencing, and then also expanding my outreach through the podcast. And eventually those things kind of merged together, which seems pretty natural now that I'm looking back at it. And even though I was rejected for the suicide data by job code from the Air Force on my FOIA request, I was fortunate enough to be asked by Senator Angus King, our senator here in Maine, to come on a project he was doing, interviewing Maine veterans for the interview to be admitted to the Library of Congress. And I feel very fortunate because I had been seeking data for the 3 years prior. I was looking at it was very narrow, specific to my career field. What is the health of the fleet for these particular aircraft? Because I wanted to show that it was anemic prior to massive reductions in personnel in 2014 under sequestration. I wanted to look at how many people were in these career fields from 2010 to 2019. I asked for data for how many flying hours these jets were flying to show that the productive output was still being met. So essentially the idea was the fleet wasn't healthy before. We cut a bunch of people, we maintained the same operational tempo, and then suicide spiked up. And I had all that data for my interview with Senator King, which I think surprised him a little bit. And then after the interview finished, I asked for his help getting the information. And he had asked me if he just wanted to get the information to me. And I said, well, actually, I was seeking a lot of this information to give to you because you're on the Senate Armed Services Committee. And a month later, I worked with his staff, and they asked if it would be okay if they commissioned legislation for a study for the DoD to conduct a study of suicides by job code across all branches, all components from 2001 until present information. That report is due December 31st of this year. And that's certainly probably not the end of the work, but it might show and highlight that there is something going on within these specific areas, which to me, going back to being a veterans disability attorney, this is what you hear about in a lot of our cases and from a lot of our clients is they have an experience within this community while they're serving that is unique, but also foreign to anyone outside of that community. Because when I talk about my time in aircraft maintenance, aircraft maintainers absolutely understand what I'm talking about and the dynamics and the harm and all those things, but people outside that career field and then outside the military really don't understand it. So for me, the report coming out, I think, is going to show some pretty stark disparities from one career field to another, which the idea is that's going to garner a whole bunch of questions from people that have oversight. So I'm looking forward to it because A, I've probably poured thousands of hours into this work, and B, once this information goes public, I probably will have to spend less of my time advocating because I think a lot of other people will start asking the same questions I've been asking.
So your hope is that this data will demonstrate that there are particular fields of work or service within the several services actually, that put more pressure and are likely to have a greater risk of harm to individual service members that are in those occupations?
I do, and I think that's where the military is going to have a hard time explaining how those career fields don't, because you have, in the military, you have essentially a very apples to apples population. Typically, career fields have all races, all genders, and the age range is typically the 17 to 45-year-old. So you're going to have a hard time blaming something outside the career field for why these numbers are so disparate, is what I suspect.
Well, it'll be very interesting to see those numbers. We'll have to have you come back and talk about them once the numbers are out at the end of the year. But in the meantime, can you touch a little more on how your experience, in your opinion, helps you to understand particular veterans' claims when you're presenting them?
Yeah, so when I speak to veterans, when I've talked to some of our clients, when I've done hearings with them, a lot of the feedback I've gotten has been very positive. I think part of it lies in the fact that as a baseline, I understand their experience, and I also imagine how I'd want to be spoken to if I was the client. In one instance, we kind of talked about military sexual trauma. I had a case a while ago where that was one of the issues that was on appeal, and I recognized that I was in a distinctly disadvantaged position as a man to be talking about military sexual trauma, as a prior military member talking about military sexual trauma to this client. So for me, the goal was to be as accommodating as possible and to allow the client to really tell their story, to avoid triggering any sort of these things, because the last thing I wanted to do was to break a trust with the client or to make it more difficult for them to explain to the judge exactly what their experience was and exactly how it impacts them now. And if I wasn't as accommodating and empathetic to their condition, I think it might have had a much worse outcome.
I can appreciate that. And, one of the things that has surprised me in the years I've been doing this work is that there are large numbers of men who suffer from military sexual trauma. I had never really appreciated that fact before I started doing this work, and it has been very surprising to me the extent to which that seems to have occurred, particularly in earlier years in the military. My impression is that things are somewhat better. I haven't had as many veterans who served more recently who have raised that issue, but apparently because of the way the chain of command worked and the way things were largely insulated from the outside, as you alluded to earlier, that was a serious problem. I have the impression that with some recent publicity about that issue and some more focus on it, it may not be as widespread as it was, but I've been very surprised at the extent to which people have been facing that issue and the difficulty they've had coming to terms with having to talk about that and having to explain why they never reported it at the time. It's been a very challenging issue for a number of clients.
Yeah, I think when we're talking about MST, I think there's a lot of interplay there. First of all, I think, and certainly I'm not a psychologist by any stretch of the imagination, but I think the MST experience between a male service member and a female service member are kind of different because for a very, very long time, the military was male-dominated, and women that would report MST would very often feel unheard, unlistened to, like there was no purpose, there would be retaliation and things like that. Whereas I think there is a attachment of just shame overall, which makes it a different culture that kind of discourages reporting. And I think there's also an important thing prior to, I think it was 2011, we were under Don't Ask, Don't Tell until the late 90s, and prior to the late 90s it was a strict, policy against gay and lesbian service members serving. And I think that creates, when you have those types of prohibitions and restrictions, it creates a environment that makes it much harder to report these things. And that's, I think, where we see probably a lot of reports happening now of people that served much longer in the past because they were under these very strict cloaks that were meant, or not meant, but maybe in practice created a severe lack of reporting. And again, it goes back to what I talked about in the beginning. If they didn't report it then, now the evidence is much harder to capture, and that's where it almost creates this very vicious cycle of underreporting and then burdening the veteran with proving that something happened when they were in an environment that made gathering evidence and proof exceptionally difficult.
Yeah, that's certainly been the experience I've seen with a number of clients. Very difficult area. But turning back to your personal experience, any other cases that you found particularly striking that you've been working on?
Again, I think I had a client that had some spinal issues, and it was essentially a continuous sort of repetitive use sort of injury, and the final acute event was off duty. So then it became this, now we need to show that the 7 years of heavy lifting without appropriate equipment or personnel to help lift was just a distinct contributing factor to this acute event that may have happened off duty, but there's this long history of just in that career, that type of repetitive use that very likely impacted the joints and the back in such a way that made that acute event happen. And that's where, certainly working in aircraft maintenance, bending down, working a lot of hours, but also lifting heavy things and being in awkward spaces. And, that's something that I personally experienced. So I definitely understood that sometimes just doing the job creates these lasting degenerative injuries.
I'm glad you brought that up because that again is an issue that seems to quite pervasive. We've had lots of clients who, as you explained, had an MOS where they did repetitive heavy work, and the result was that kind of the cumulative effect ultimately led to whether it's a spinal injury or various other body parts, but the cumulative effect of doing this over time just kind of wears the body out. And we run into, in several cases, there is a pattern of that happening, and then the person will have, maybe 1 or 2 visits to the medical folks while in the service, and then the problem will continue post-service, but they, for example, don't have insurance or some other situation where they don't get treatment outside the service. They just kind of tough it out, take lots of Advil or whatever, and then they'll have a further event that just makes the problem so critical they have to get medical attention. And the service records will be viewed by the VA as not being supportive. They'll say, well, really, there was nothing wrong with you when you left the service. Your exit exam doesn't show any terrible problem with your back or your shoulder or whatever it was. And it's really all of this post-service thing. You had an injury, and that's what it's all about. And that's been difficult to surmount in several cases. But I know it's a recurring problem. I'm glad you brought it up.
Yeah, and that also made me think of, I worked night shift, I worked long hours. Typically, medical appointments were not available at 3 o'clock in the morning when my circadian rhythm was said to be awake because of my shift schedule. So there was all these things that would frustrate going and seeking treatment. Just if you imagine a person that works during the daytime, what if you're told that, hey, you have a medical appointment at 2 in the morning? Imagine getting 4 hours of sleep and then going to your medical appointment and having to go back to sleep. But then there's also this sort of culture of you just kind of don't report these things. For me, it felt like when I would seek treatment, it would be just symptom mitigation, sort of. It would just be, I used to describe it as essentially a candy machine full of Motrin. Just walk in, turn the knob, get your Motrin, and leave. So then it kind of is like, it's a defeated sort of mindset, like why bother going? And then when you're at the end of your service, you realize there's so many things that I've experienced that is not in my records, and you start to get panicked and you want to go and see the doctor, but there's also a sense of shame or guilt or you're going to be perceived as malingering or misrepresenting these things. And I mean, I certainly experienced that. In my last year in the service, I tried to make appointments, but there was maybe shame's the right word, or hesitation or fear of how it'd be perceived, but they were all like legitimate conditions that I had. And I'm glad that I went and sought treatment, and I'm glad I included it at the end of my career physical, because some of those visits were pivotal in, granting claims that I had submitted on my behalf.
We have, as you know, one of our attorneys who was a colonel, a nurse, and running a unit. She was talking about her advice to her son, who was just getting ready to leave the military. And she told him, you go and report every single thing that's happened to you in your entire time in the service and make sure it's in your record.
Yeah.
And I think that was good advice. I hope those folks who are still in the service and see this podcast will take that to heart and do that. I'm sorry to say we're running out of time for today, but it's been very, very nice to have the chance to chat with you about this. And why don't you go ahead and tell our viewers where they can find your podcast?
You can find my podcast on all podcast hosting services. It's called 20 Years Done. The logo is a fist standing up holding a wrench, which I had that made in 2018, and I can't think of a better representation of what exactly my podcast is about.
Well, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to chat with you this morning. And to our viewers, please pass this podcast on to veterans that you know and those who care about veterans, and tune in next week.
Thanks for joining us this week on the Victory Over VA podcast. Make sure to visit our website, veteransbenefits.com/podcast, where you can subscribe to the show in iTunes, Spotify, or via RSS, so you'll never miss a show. While you're at it, if you found value in this show, we'd appreciate a rating on iTunes, or if you'd simply tell a friend about the show, that would help us out too. If you like this show, you might want to check out our free consultation to see how we can help you with your denied claim. Simply go to veteransbenefits.com and fill out the form. You fought for us. Now let us fight for you. And be sure to tune in next week for our next episode.